After its release, Resident Evil 5 would quickly shoot up to be the best-selling Resident Evil game of all time. This is a title that RE5 actually still holds to this day, with over 15.2 million copies sold in the last 16 years. And while Capcom has certainly made a lot of questionable business decisions over the years, they of course weren't going to let this be the end of Resident Evil 5's success. They had a team start working on some DLC content to fill the gap between the releases of RE5 and RE6, and over the course of about a year, we would see the releases of 5 separate DLC packs. And while I was initially just going to make a quick mention of these DLCs in my main RE5 video, I ultimately realized that there's enough here to warrant a whole separate video, even if it is going to be a bit shorter than most videos in this series have been. Plus, some later games in the series have a ton of DLC that will end up making for much longer videos, so just for the sake of consistency, this is what we're doing. So were these DLCs any good? And more importantly, are they worth going back and checking out if you missed them back in the day? Well, let's talk about it. But before getting too far into the video, I should mention that this is the 16th in a series of videos where I'm playing and reviewing every game in the Resident Evil franchise in release order. You don't have to have seen the other videos in the series in order to enjoy this one, but I would obviously recommend that you've at least seen my video on Resident Evil 5, as that's pretty much the basis of what we're talking about here. So for those of you who are interested in checking out that, or the series as a whole, I'll have the full series playlist in the description below. But with that out of the way, let's quickly talk about how I'm going to format these DLC videos. I'm going to quickly cover each DLC release for the game, since all of them here in RE5 are actually really short, and rather than giving them a number score like I typically do, I'll instead be looking at the price tag that the DLC launched with, and determining whether or not that new content was worthwhile for the price. It's worth noting that if you go to buy the DLCs nowadays on modern systems, there is just a $15 bundle that includes every DLC for the game, but I'm trying to keep this interesting and give them their own ratings somehow, so we'll just be looking at the prices that they originally launched with. Okay, so now that we're all on the same page, let's get into the first DLC release for Resident Evil 5, the Versus Mode pack. The Versus Mode pack was only released about a month after the base game, coming out in April of 2009 at a price of $5 USD. This pack was a small collection of 4 new game modes for the game's Mercenaries minigame, which I haven't mentioned up to this point in the retrospective, but Mercenaries is always just a fun little horde mode of sorts that's been a tradition for the series since it started in Resident Evil 3. These modes all centered around introducing some competitive and PvP elements to the mode, pitting multiple players against each other in a variety of different ways. The first of these is the Slayers mode, which pits 2 to 4 players against each other in a free-for-all. The objective here is to kill as many Magini as possible to try to score more points in the time limit than any other player in the lobby. You can also try to kill the other players while doing so because PvP is enabled in this, but in my admittedly limited experience with the mode, it seems like it's just not really worth the effort. I was of course playing this with friend of the show False, who may as well just be the designated player 2 of the series at this point, and we did a lot of fighting during our first few minutes with the mode, but we quickly found out that you can just stockpile points faster by focusing on the monsters. So unless one of us actively started a fight with the other, we kind of just kept to ourselves and competed for points instead, since it was normally more effective that way. That being said though, dying in this mode will cause you to lose a large chunk of your points, so you could try to take out the player in the lead to sabotage them and get ahead more easily. It's just that generally it's easier to build points on your own by fighting the hordes instead. Then there's the Team Slayers mode, which, as you might have been able to guess, is the exact same thing but in a 2v2 format rather than a free-for-all. There's not really a whole lot to talk about there, it is literally the exact same mode, just with teams of 2 instead. The third mode in this pack is the Survivors mode. Survivors is another 2 to 4 player free-for-all mode, but unlike your typical Mercenaries experience, killing monsters is actually not required whatsoever. This time around, you'll score points by dealing damage to the other players in the lobby, and every time you take damage whether from a player or a monster, some of your score will be taken away. The weapon loadouts that each character would normally start with in Mercenaries have also been totally changed here, with each player only getting a specific starting pistol and a grenade whenever they respawn. Other weapons can be found while playing, namely by doing things like killing the mini-boss enemies that spawn in, with them dropping things like shotguns, rifles, or magnums to reward you for taking the time to fight them. So it's basically the same as the Slayers mode, but with more of a direct emphasis on the PvP rather than a combination of PvE and PvP. And the fourth and final mode in the Versus Pack is the Team Survivors mode, which is again just a 2v2 variant of the normal Survivors mode. Trying to judge the Versus Pack as a whole is a little difficult for me. I didn't expect that Resident Evil PvP would be something I enjoyed, but playing it with a friend recently was actually a lot of fun. Both of us went in not really expecting anything from it and kind of just going to check it off the list, but we ended up both having a blast and honestly just laughing our asses off the whole time we played it. But with the launch price of $5, I'm not sure I could really recommend it to everyone. They were a lot of fun to play around with for the short time that we did, but I'm not sure if I would necessarily tell people to pay $5 for what are effectively just 2 new variations of the Mercenaries mode. It doesn't help that it also just feels a bit misleading to market it as 4 new game modes when it's really only 2 modes in free-for-all and 2v2 variants. So overall, I would say that the Versus Pack is maybe worth $5. It really just depends on how interested you are or aren't in the concept of Resident Evil 5 with PvP. Now, fast forward a little more than 10 months, and we would finally get the second DLC for Resident Evil 5, Lost in Nightmares. This is a full-blown story DLC that lets us play through the flashbacks we saw in RE5's main story, with Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine encountering Wesker in a mansion. The BSAA have received a tip that Umbrella's founder, Oswald Spencer, is hiding out in this mansion, and Chris and Jill are sent in to arrest him. And right from the start of the DLC, we're treated to some incredibly high-quality cutscenes that are honestly right there with the base game's cutscenes in terms of production value. Gameplay-wise, Lost in Nightmares feels totally different from the main campaign, as it's actually this slow-paced, atmospheric trek through the mansion with an insane amount of callbacks to Resident Evil 1. They've even added some unique door animations to this DLC that are supposed to emulate those old door transitions from the classic era titles, and while they're a little awkward here, it is just a really nice touch. There is a little bit of combat in this DLC, but for roughly 80% or so of its total runtime, it's more focused on the atmosphere and the puzzles. The creepiest room of all was this bathroom that we found while playing that has nothing in it but a single urinal and some toilet paper. No sink, no toilet, no trash can, just a urinal and a roll of toilet paper. It's absolutely horrifying. Jokes aside though, we move through the mansion and eventually find Spencer in the library just after Wesker has killed him. And of course, we get a final boss fight against Wesker that ultimately ends with Jill tackling him through the window like we saw in the main campaign. It's a very short DLC, with False and I taking about an hour and 10 minutes to beat it while really taking our time to soak it all in and enjoy every last bit of it. And while that makes Lost in Nightmares incredibly short, it was a really fun hour of extra story content, especially for fans like myself who started with those earlier titles in the series. Lost in Nightmares was also priced at $5 USD when it was released, and I would say that for what you're getting here, it's well worth $5. Especially so because any purchase of the Lost in Nightmares DLC would also grant you access to 2 new characters to play in the Mercenaries mode in the form of Barry Burton and Excella Gion. So for those of you that enjoy the Mercenaries, that's also a nice little bonus for you. The third DLC for the game was actually released the same day as the Lost in Nightmares DLC, and this is Costume Pack 1. This was a much smaller DLC, being priced at $2 USD, and simply being 1 costume for Sheva called Fairy Tale Sheva, and 1 costume for Chris called Warrior Chris, that are both usable only in the Mercenaries mode. These are fine, I guess, but they're really nothing to write home about. If you enjoy Mercenaries, $2 might be worth it to you to get a couple additional loadouts and costumes for Chris and Sheva, so I'll give this one another maybe rating, just depending on how much you enjoy Mercenaries. Back to something more interesting though, exactly 2 weeks after the release of Lost in Nightmares and Costume Pack 1, we got the release of another story DLC titled Desperate Escape. This DLC takes place right at the end of RE5's main story, and in it, we see Jill Valentine and Josh Stone fighting through hordes of Majini to reach the helicopter that they used to rescue Chris and Sheva from the volcano at the end of the main game. This is a much more combat-heavy DLC compared to what Lost in Nightmares was. In fact, it's entirely combat. That's not an exaggeration either. Desperate Escape is a DLC that took False and I just shy of 40 minutes to complete, and from the moment it started to the moment it ended, it was nothing but fighting hordes and hordes of Majini. So your enjoyment with Desperate Escape will entirely hinge on how much you enjoy RE5's combat, and whether or not the idea of a 30-minute challenge gauntlet sounds fun to you. I personally thought it was decently fun for what it was, but I definitely don't enjoy it anywhere near as much as I did Lost in Nightmares. The production value here was still really good though, with more brand new high quality cutscenes, and much like Lost in Nightmares, an additional 2 characters being added to the Mercenaries mode in the form of Josh Stone and Rebecca Chambers. So overall, not my favorite DLC of the bunch, but definitely my second favorite, and I would say that for its original price of $5, this was still pretty good value. And finally, the last DLC that we got for Resident Evil 5 was also released on the exact same day as Desperate Escape, this being Costume Pack 2. This, once again, is a smaller pack that includes 1 new costume and loadout for Chris, and 1 new costume and loadout for Sheva in the Mercenaries mode. Chris this time gets an infinite ammo Gatling gun, as well as some pretty cool body armor and tattoos. And Sheva gets to play the role of the sexy secretary, I guess. Pretty much everything I said about Costume Pack 1 applies here. It's a nice little $2 package if that's your thing, but if it's not, then you can easily just skip right over this one. So overall, the quality of RE5's DLC can vary quite a bit, but I wouldn't say that any of it is necessarily bad. In fact, I would say that it's all good, but it's all just made for different demographics. Even the DLCs that I don't care much for personally, namely the costume packs, were probably really sweet deals for people who are huge fans of the Mercenaries mode. Desperate Escape, while I thought it was good but not great, would be an awesome piece of additional content for people who love RE5's gameplay loop or just want a little bit more Jill Valentine in their life. And Lost in Nightmares, in my opinion, was an awesome little piece of story content that easily could have fit into the main campaign, though for others who prefer the more action horror style of the series, they might not be that huge on it. RE5's DLC had a little something for everyone, and the best part was that all of these individual pieces of content were separated into their own packs and sold for really low prices, meaning you could just grab whatever you wanted and easily ignore the rest. Regardless of what kind of Resident Evil fan you are, there's at least one piece of DLC content here that you'll enjoy, and I think that's really commendable on Capcom's part. If anything in this video caught your eye, then I could honestly recommend checking it out, so long as you keep in mind that these were small pieces of content that were only meant to last you a couple hours or so. So at the end of the day, I'll give Resident Evil 5's DLC a rating of play some of it, but not all of it. Pick and choose what you want. Hey guys, thank you for sticking through this little side project of the retrospective. I'm still trying to figure out this format a bit, and I'm not sure if it's entirely there, so feel free to leave any feedback that you have in the comments below so that I can try to apply that to the DLC videos for future games. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a like, a sub, or even go and check out things like my channel memberships or my Patreon if you want to join the group of incredible people who make series like this one possible. Thank you all again for watching, guys, and I hope to see all of you right back here for the next Resident Evil review.